The first man raised a hand to silence it. His eyes stayed fixed on May, weighing her like a horse at market. She didn't flinch under the weight of his stare, didn't look away, didn't shrink. The wind tugged at her skirts and howled through the gaps in the cookhouse walls, but she stood firm, her breath rising in pale clouds. "What is it you're after then?" he asked finally, his tone neither softening nor sharpening, but carrying the kind of edge that could cut either way. "Work," she said. "Just that. One word, plain and hard as iron. I can cook. Better than most. I don't drink, I don't complain, and I don't ask for charity." The man's jaw worked as if he were chewing her words like tough gristle. Behind him, the others shifted, glances passing between them. A woman in a cowboy camp was trouble. Everyone knew it. Trouble for the men, trouble for the work, trouble for the man who ran the place. But there was something about her, standing there in mismatched gloves and worn boots, shoulders squared against the winter, that made silence stretch long after she had spoken. At last he gave a small grunt. "Kitchen's cold and the pay's worse. Men eat before dawn and again long after it's gone. You take it, you stay out of their way. You don't, you walk back out that gate before the snow buries your tracks." May nodded once, crisp and certain. "I'll take it." The cookhouse door creaked on its hinges as she stepped inside, the warmth of the stove rushing against her face like a blessing. The room was plain. Wooden counters scarred with years of knives, a blackened stove heavy with iron pots, and a smell of grease and smoke ground so deep into the walls it would never wash out. She set her satchel on the floor, loosened her gloves, and rolled up her sleeves. No one said a word as she set to work. She pulled flour from the bin, stoked the fire, and moved like someone who had done this in harder kitchens than these men would ever know. The cowboys watched from the doorway, quiet now, the kind of quiet that came when men didn't yet know if they were looking at salvation or disaster. Snow piled against the windows, and the night settled heavy around the ranch. May worked until her fingers were stiff and her back ached. But she kept moving, the rhythm of chopping and stirring and kneading louder than the wind. By the time the first loaf of bread came out of the oven, golden and hot, the smell filled the room, cutting through the stench of smoke and sweat. The tall man with the gray in his beard stepped forward again. He tore a piece of bread free, steam rising in the cold air, and chewed it slow. His face gave nothing away. Then he nodded once. "She stays." It was no welcome, no kindness, just a sentence, flat and final. But May understood it for what it was. She had a place for now. What none of them knew, not even May, was that the land she had just claimed a corner of, the ground frozen solid beneath her boots, belonged not to the tall man, nor to the cowboys watching her with wary eyes. It belonged to one of them, a younger man who had yet to speak, who leaned against the far post with arms crossed and eyes unreadable. He had not laughed, had not spoken, had not moved, but he was watching her in a way that made her spine burn. The ranch would not stay the same now, not with her here. The young man leaning against the post said nothing as the others filed out, muttering about horses, fences, and the storm still screaming across the plains. He stayed where he was, half-shadowed, his hat pulled low, arms folded tight. Only his eyes moved, tracking her every motion. May ignored him at first. She pulled another pan from the stove, sliced the bread, and laid it out in neat rows as if the act itself could shield her from the weight of his gaze. But she could feel it, like heat against her skin, steady and unbroken. Finally, when the last plate was set and her hands were still, she looked up. "You've been staring long enough," she said quietly. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite mockery. "Just wondering how long you'll last." "As long as I have to." Her voice was even, calm, though her pulse kicked hard beneath her ribs. He straightened from the post, boots echoing against the wooden floor as he crossed the room. He moved with a slow, deliberate ease, like a man who didn't need to prove strength because it had already been tested more times than most could count. Up close, May saw he wasn't as young as she'd thought. Maybe 30, maybe a little older, with lines etched at the corners of his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. "You got a name?" he asked. "May. Just May." It's the only part that matters. Something in his gaze shifted, softened for the briefest second, then hardened again. Well, May, you ought to know something. This ranch doesn't keep folks who don't belong. Winter sorts the strong from the weak, and land sorts the rest. Most who come here don't stay. I ain't most, she answered, lifting her chin. For a heartbeat, silence hung thick between them, heavier than the storm outside. Then he gave another one of those knot smiles, tipped his hat, and turned for the door. Good, he said. We'll see. The door slammed behind him, and she was alone again with the fire. That night, when the cowboys filed in from the barn, stomping snow from their boots and shaking frost from their coats, the cookhouse felt different. It wasn't just the warm bread or the stew simmering on the stove. It was her presence, steady, unyielding, a woman standing in the center of a place that had never been meant for her. They ate in silence at first, too surprised to trust what they were tasting, until one man swore softly under his breath. Damn, he muttered, tearing another piece of bread. This is better than my mama's. Laughter broke out then, low and rough but warmer than before. Some even raised their cups to her, not quite respect, not yet, but a recognition that she had earned the right to be here for one night at least. But not everyone was pleased. The thick-set cowboy with mean eyes leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching her like a wolf circles a stray lamb. Trouble sat in the curl of his lip, in the weight of his stare. May felt it. She met his eyes once, steady and unafraid, then turned back to her work. Later, when the fire burned low and the men had gone back to their bunks, she stepped outside into the snow. The night was silent now, muffled by drifts that covered the earth like a burial shroud. Her breath plumed white as she looked out over the endless plains, the moonlight turning every flake into silver. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She wasn't begging. She had a place, fragile though it was. But deep down, she knew the fight wasn't over. This land was not gentle. These men were not kind. And the one with unreadable eyes, the quiet one who had asked her name, he was not done with her yet. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf howled. And May, pulling her thin coat tighter, whispered to herself, "Let it come. I've faced worse." He had stood by once, and it had eaten him ever since. Snow drifted sideways in the yard, faint against the lantern glow leaking from the cookhouse. Caleb's jaw tightened as he watched her thread the needle, steady despite the raw scrape across her palm. She shifted in her chair, the fire casting her in shades of copper and shadow. He thought of that night in Billings, the spilled tray, the men laughing, her eyes daring them all to strike. He had done nothing then. But tonight, something coiled in him refused to stay still. Caleb took a step forward, boots crunching in the snow. He hesitated at the door, hand hovering near the latch. His breath came out sharp in the frozen air. For a long moment he considered walking away again. Let the wood be enough. Let silence cover the rest. But silence had been his sin once before, and he could taste the rot of it still. He knocked. The sound was soft, but May heard. She set the shirt aside, rose slowly, and pulled the door open. The lantern caught him, his hat pulled low, snow in his beard, eyes dark as the storm behind him. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "You're up late," Caleb said finally, his voice low, gravel smoothed by hesitation. "So are you," she answered. Her eyes flicked to the bundle of wood on the stoop. "That yours?" He shifted, uneasy. "Figured you could use it." Her gaze held him, sharp and searching. "Why?" The question was plain, but it landed heavy. Caleb swallowed hard, a muscle working in his jaw. He could have lied, could have said it was nothing, that he was just being decent. But something in her stare stripped the excuses from him. "Because I should have spoken once before," he said, his voice rough, almost breaking. "And I didn't." May blinked. She didn't move, didn't answer right away, but the silence between them thickened with meaning. Finally, she stepped back from the door. "Well, don't stand out there freezing. Come in, then." Caleb hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The door shut against the storm, muting the howl of the wind until only the soft crackle of the stove remained. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands like a man unsure of where to set down his burdens. May sat again, picking up her mending, her fingers steady but her eyes sharper than the needle. "You've been watching me since the day I walked in," she said. "Not like the others, but watching all the same." "Why?" Caleb lowered himself onto the bench opposite her, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. "Because I remember you," he said. "Billings. Rosebell. I saw what happened that night. I did nothing. Been carrying that ever since." The needle stilled in May's hands. Her eyes flicked up to his, unreadable. For a long, unbroken moment she said nothing, only studied him, as if weighing the truth of his words against the man in front of her. Then she set the shirt aside. "You were just a boy," she said softly, "and boys make mistakes. I should have been a man," he answered, voice taut. The fire snapped between them, the sound filling the space where confession and forgiveness wrestled in silence. May leaned back, crossing her arms. "Maybe, but I don't need saving, Caleb. Not then. Not now." He met her gaze. "I know. Doesn't change what I owe." Her lips pressed together, not quite a frown, not quite a smile. Outside, the storm raged, but in that little cookhouse, a different storm was gathering, quieter, deeper. One that had been building since the moment their eyes had met again on the frozen Montana dirt. The stove hissed, swallowing wood, throwing shadows that licked the rough walls. May leaned forward, her hands folded, the lamplight painting the lines of weariness across her face. Caleb had seen women broken by less than what she had survived, yet here she sat, back straight, chin unbent. "You think I need you to make peace with yourself?" she said at last, her voice even, though her eyes held fire. Caleb's jaw worked, but he didn't flinch. "Maybe I do, but that ain't all of it." Her brow arched, daring him. "Then what?" He drew in a long breath, set his hat down on the table. His hands were scarred, calloused, trembling faintly as if the truth had weight. "You walked onto this ranch like you had nothing left, but you held your head higher than any of us. I seen men twice your size fold under less. And it struck me." He paused, searching for words that weren't soft, weren't foolish but true. "I reckon I ain't seen anything stronger than you, May Rose." The name slipped off his tongue like it had been carved there for years. May's eyes flickered. The corners of her mouth trembled. Somewhere between disbelief and a smile she refused to let form. She turned away, busying her hands with the mending she'd abandoned. The needle shook once, then steadied. "You talk pretty for a cowboy," she said, her voice guarded. "Don't mistake truth for pretty," Caleb murmured. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Outside, the storm clawed at the shutters, but inside the air was warmer than it had been in months. At last, May set the shirt down again, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at him fully now, her eyes soft but sharp enough to cut. "You carry guilt for Billings. I carry scars. We both lived. Maybe that's all there needs to be." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice dropped low, rough. "But what if it ain't enough?" Her breath caught. For the first time since she walked into the Stone River Ranch, someone had cracked her armor. Before she could answer, the door banged hard against the wind. Both their heads snapped toward it. A shadow moved outside the window, broad shoulders cutting across the lantern glow. Heavy boots crunched in the snow. Then another. Then two more. The storm hadn't driven all the cowboys to their bunks after all. A low voice, thick with drink, bled through the cracks. "Told you she was hiding in here. Thought she was too good to share a fire with us." Another laugh followed, mean and sharp. May stiffened. Caleb rose, slow, deliberate, like a man who had been waiting for this moment longer than he'd admit. His hand hovered near his belt, not for a pistol. He hadn't carried one in years, but for the resolve he'd buried deep. He glanced back at her once, his voice calm but firm. "Stay behind me." May's chin lifted, defiance sparking. "Don't you dare treat me like I'm breakable." He almost smiled, even with danger breathing against the door. Then stand beside me. The latch rattled. The door shuddered. And in the hush before it burst open, the fire crackled like a heartbeat. Caleb sat in that cold cookhouse until dawn bled gray across the windows. The silence pressed on him heavier than the snow. He had known hunger, war, loss of blood and brother, but this absence felt like a knife drawn slow across the ribs. He pressed his palms against the scarred wood of the table, the faint scent of onions and smoke still clinging to it. Every mark, every scrape in that room was her, carved without meaning to. He closed his eyes, listening for footsteps that would never come. By morning, the bunkhouse stirred. Cowboys shuffled into the yard, pulling on boots, stamping warmth into their feet. A few glanced toward the cookhouse and muttered when no smoke trailed from the chimney. They knocked once, then twice until Caleb stepped out. His face was pale in the bitter light, his voice low when he said, "She's gone." The men looked at one another, unease settling in. It wasn't just the loss of meals. It was the loss of a presence they hadn't understood until it had been taken from them. One spat into the snow, another cursed under his breath. Caleb turned his back on them, went to the stable, and busied himself with tack and saddles. But his mind was still inside that kitchen, at that table, with the letter folded and waiting in her book. May, meanwhile, walked the long road toward town, the satchel cut into her shoulder, the cold chewing her breath, but she did not slow. Every step was a strike against the life that wanted to chain her. Every mile between her and Stone River Ranch was a vow. She would not belong to anyone's pity, anyone's fire. She had carried her mother's words across too many nights to falter now. In town, the world was not kinder, but it was louder. Wagons rattled, boots clattered on wooden planks, doors slammed against the wind. May pressed forward, slipping through clusters of men smoking outside saloons, dodging women with baskets and children trailing like shadows. She stopped at the general store, trading a jar of preserves for flour, another for coffee beans. The shopkeep eyed her curiously, but she offered no explanation. By evening, she rented a room above the livery stable. The window was cracked, the bed straw thin, but she set her book on the table with the care of someone laying down a newborn. She lit the single lamp, opened the cover, and there it was, his letter. Her breath caught. For a long moment she only stared, the paper trembling in her hands. Then she read. Each word struck deeper than the last. She pressed the page flat, tears pricking her eyes though she refused to let them fall. She whispered into the empty room, "Too late, Caleb Stone. Too late." But her hand did not put the letter away. It lingered on the paper, tracing the letters as if they were carved into him, as if she could feel his voice through the ink. Back at the ranch, Caleb mounted his horse at dusk. He rode out across the frozen flats, the land swallowing him whole. No one asked where he went. No one stopped him. The snow came harder, whipping his face raw, but he kept riding toward town, toward the chance that maybe he hadn't lost her yet. In her room above the livery, May sat at the window. The lamplight flickered over her cheek, casting her shadow across the bare floorboards. She did not sleep. She could not. Something in her chest was restless, like a fire she tried to smother but that still smoldered beneath the ash. And somewhere in that storm, two paths bent toward each other again. Caleb stayed at that table until the gray seeped into the windows. His elbows planted in the grooves, her hands had worn into the wood. The men stirred in the bunkhouse, boots thudding, voices rough with sleep, laughter edged with cold. Ranch life does not pause for heartbreak, and the sound of it pressed against him like a reminder. The land asks for work, not sorrow. He rose, went to the barn, and lost himself in the weight of it. Saddles slung over rails, tack stiff with frozen sweat, horses stamping as if impatient for him to stop thinking. He worked until his palms burned, until the ache of his muscles numbed the ache of his chest. But every corner of the ranch bore her mark. The cookhouse smelled faintly of onions and flour. The bunkhouse table held the shine of her rag. Even the silence at supper carried her absence like a missing note in a song. That evening, the first snowstorm of the season rolled down from the high ridge. The wind howled across the plains, slamming against the shutters, driving the cattle into tight knots near the fence line. Caleb rode hard through it, his coat stiff with ice, the lantern on his saddle swinging like a beacon in the storm. He tried to convince himself it was duty, that he rode for the herd, not because the white horizon made him think of her boots sinking into snow, not because he feared the land would swallow her whole if she went too far alone. Miles away, May walked with her satchel pressed against her side, each step slower than the last. The storm caught her before she found shelter, snow clinging to her lashes, breath clouding in ragged bursts. She pulled her scarf higher, fought the sting in her fingers, and forced herself forward. She had left places before, men too, but never had the leaving felt like tearing something alive from her chest. By nightfall she stumbled into an abandoned line shack, little more than 4 walls and a roof warped by time. The wind screamed through the cracks, but it was shelter. She dropped her satchel, struck a match with trembling hands, and coaxed a small flame to life in the old stove. The heat was weak, but it was something. She sat close, unwrapped her book, and let her hands trace the worn cover like it was a heartbeat. That was when she found the letter tucked inside. Her breath caught. She read it once, then again, each line pressed deeper than the one before, not because of the words themselves, but because they felt stripped bare of anything but truth. Her jaw tightened, eyes stinging as she folded it back into the book. She wanted to throw it into the fire. She wanted to cradle it close. Instead, she pressed it between the pages and sat in silence, the storm raging outside while something just as wild raged inside her. At dawn, Caleb rode out again, the snow thick and heavy. He told himself he was checking fence lines, but he rode toward the ridge, toward the trails she might have taken. The storm had left no tracks, only endless white, but he kept riding. By midday he found the line shack. Smoke curled weakly from its chimney. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching through the drifts, heart pounding as if each step forward cost him something he couldn't name. Inside, May sat by the stove, her hair loose, her scarf damp from melted snow. She looked up when the door opened, but she did not rise. Caleb shut the door softly, removed his hat, and stood dripping on the floorboards. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind shrieking outside and the faint pop of burning wood. "You followed me," she said at last, her voice low, guarded. "I rode the storm," Caleb answered, his throat raw. "Didn't know if I'd find you here or nowhere at all." Her eyes flicked toward her satchel, then back to him. "And if I hadn't wanted to be found?" He swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the brim of his hat. "Then I'd have left you to your fire. But I had to see. Just once more." Silence settled again. May turned back to the stove, poking at the flame with a piece of iron. "You left me words," she said finally. "Words don't keep a woman warm." "No," Caleb admitted. "But I wrote them because I couldn't let them die inside me. I didn't expect you to read them. I only hoped," his voice cracked, "I hoped you'd know I saw you. Truly." Her shoulders trembled, though whether from cold or something deeper, she couldn't say. She closed her eyes, the ache of wanting to believe him fighting with the weight of every disappointment she'd ever carried. Finally, she whispered, "You think truth fixes what's already broken?" Caleb took a step closer, his boots hollow on the boards. "No, but it's the only place to start. And if it takes the rest of my life to prove it, I will." May's hands stilled on the iron. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to him. The storm raged outside, beating the shack like a drum, but in that moment the only storm that mattered was the one between them. She saw him not as a rancher's son or a man hiding behind a name, but as someone standing stripped of pride, asking not for forgiveness, but for a chance. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she shifted, sliding the cookbook across the table toward him. "If you mean it," she said softly, "then start here. Make a fire that doesn't die when I turn my back." Caleb looked down at the book, at the faint smudge of her mother's handwriting peeking from the edges. His throat tightened. He set his hat aside, drew in a long breath, and sat across from her. The storm would pass. The snow would melt. But some fires, once lit, did not fade. Outside, the plains lay buried in white silence. Inside, two lives, worn thin by loss, leaned slowly toward the fragile warmth of something that might, against all odds, hold. She found the letter on the third night. May had made it only as far as the boarding house in town. Her savings barely enough for a week's cot and a chipped cup of cold tea. Her small satchel sat at the foot of the bed, carrying nothing of real value except a worn cookbook she had carried from place to place. She had not dared to open it until now. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the stained pages, searching for comfort in recipes she barely remembered. When she tried to scribble down a new soup on the last page, her fingers brushed the edge of something thin, hidden. She slid it free. A folded letter. The paper was soft with age, the ink faded but steady. She unfolded it slowly, and though she read it twice, the words still struck her like a spark in the dark. At first, she pressed it to her chest, her breath catching as though the letter itself carried warmth she had forgotten. Outside, the snow howled against the thin window panes. Wind scraped across the boards like a storm without end. But inside her something shifted. Not the pain never vanished so quickly. But there was a new thread woven through it now. A fragile belief that maybe not every man was too late. Some just needed a fire they could not ignore. Time passed, and the sun eventually spilled gold across the Montana plains. It was a slow kind of light, steady, soft, and forgiving. It warmed the beams of a small building that stood beside an old trail once trampled by cattle drives. Now it led to something gentler. A carved wooden sign swayed above the door, May's table. The front porch was wide, lined with benches worn smooth by boots and elbows. Old cowboys sat there smoking pipes, and children laughed as they licked jam from their fingers. Inside, the air always smelled like cinnamon, honey, and smoked pork. Shelves along the walls held jars of preserves, books left behind by travelers, and hand-sewn quilts folded neatly in stacks. At the long counter, a fresh pie always waited, and behind that counter was May. Her hands were steady now, her laughter light and unafraid. She wore her apron with quiet pride, and she never flinched at raised voices anymore. By the window sat a painted tin marked Dreams, where she taught the local girls to drop in a few coins whenever they could. She told them to save for something real, something that could not be taken. Outside, Caleb worked the soil. His sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands rough with earth. He knelt among rows of herbs and tomatoes as though each plant were a friend worth tending. He didn't talk much, but when he looked at May, it was with no shadow, no shame, just truth. Every Saturday, children gathered by the back door. May showed them how to knead dough, how to tell when oil was ready, and how to laugh when flour dusted their hair. She told stories while stirring stew, stories of the land and its storms, but she rarely spoke of her past unless someone asked. Sometimes travelers wandered in. A stranger at the counter might lean close and say, "Ma'am, you sure do cook like you've been doing this forever. Where'd you learn?" May would smile faintly, wipe her hands on her apron, and glance at Caleb. "I used to cook for men who never knew my name," she'd reply. "Now I cook for a man who looks me in the eye." No one asked further. The day of their wedding was quiet, simple, and true. They stood in a meadow washed in late spring light. Wildflowers bent in the breeze. The sky stretched wide and endless. May wore a dress she had sewn herself. Plain linen, tied with a blue ribbon Caleb had found in an old drawer. Caleb wore his best shirt, a quiet smile, and nothing else to prove. They stood beneath a crooked oak tree with only 2 witnesses and a preacher too shy to meet their eyes. When the vows ended, Caleb reached into his pocket and drew out a handkerchief. Not silk, not lace, just soft cotton, embroidered in faded red thread with a single word, "Forgiven." He tied it gently around May's wrist, a vow that needed no voice. Her eyes shone as she looked up at him, not with tears but with a brightness that belonged only to beginnings. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for staying when I gave you every reason not to." They turned together toward the trail, hand in hand, sunlight catching the embroidered word on her wrist. There was no need to run anymore, no need to hide. They had built something that could not be burned. Not by fire, not by shame, not even by memory. And that was the beginning of everything. Thank you for riding with us through the smoke of old kitchens, the silence of regret, and the quiet grace of redemption. May and Caleb's story is a reminder that the past does not define us. What defines us is the courage to stay, the choice to begin again, and the love we dare to hold when the world tells us it is too late. Love, real love, does not ask for perfection. It asks only for truth, and for the strength to stand beside it. If this story touched your heart, there are more waiting on the horizon. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for tales of grit, passion, and second chances. Stories born of a land where the wind still whispers of scars, and every heart carries a frontier. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell. Ride with us. Because love in the Wild West ain't always pretty, but it's always worth it. Seasons passed, and the little place they built together grew into more than just a cookhouse. Folks called it the Maze Table not just because of the hand-carved sign swinging above the porch, but because anyone who walked through its doors seemed to find a way out of whatever tangled road had brought them there. Cowboys too tired of the trail, widows with more silence than they could carry, children needing a warm biscuit and a safe corner to laugh, all found their way in. May never turned anyone out hungry. Sometimes she asked for a dime, sometimes a story, but most often she just said, "Sit, eat. Tomorrow will come soon enough." Caleb, steady as the earth itself, became the soul of the place in ways he never expected. He planted rows of beans and corn by the riverbank, built a smokehouse from old stone, and taught boys who had nothing but restless fists how to mend fences, sharpen tools, and turn anger into work that fed others. His voice remained quiet, but his presence spoke louder than sermons. On nights when the wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters and dragging old ghosts from the corners of memory, May would sit by the fire, the word forgiven still embroidered around her wrist, worn soft by time. Caleb would sit across from her, whittling wood or mending tack. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and no words were needed. Forgiveness was not a moment. It was a choice they kept making, day after day, like kindling laid carefully to keep a fire alive. But peace, even the strongest kind, was never left untested. One winter, a stranger came through town, a man with a scar running down his cheek and eyes that spoke of debts unpaid. He carried himself with the swagger of someone used to fear. His boots stopped at the door of the Maze Table, and his fist came down on the counter with a thud that silenced the laughter inside. "I'm looking for Caleb," the man said. The room froze. May set down the tray in her hands, her pulse quickening, but her voice calm. "You found him." Caleb rose slowly from his chair at the far end, wiping his hands on a rag. He met the man's stare with that same quiet steadiness that had carried him through every trial before. No bluster, no fire, just a wall of calm that unsettled the loud. The stranger sneered. "You owe me blood for what happened in Dodge. Thought you could run. Thought you could hide." May's breath caught. She had never asked much about Caleb's past, but she knew it carried shadows. This, it seemed, was one of them. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "I don't hide, and I don't run. Not anymore." The man's hand went to the revolver at his hip. The room bristled. Cowboys at the tables shifted. The children ducked beneath benches, and May's heart pounded like a drum. But Caleb didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he set the rag down, palms open. "If it's blood you came for, I can't give you what's already spent. But I'll give you truth. I'm not the man you knew then. I won't be him again." For a long moment, the wind itself seemed to hold still. The man's finger twitched on the grip, rage warring with something harder. Confusion. Because in Caleb's eyes there was no fear, no guilt that could be preyed upon, only the unshakable weight of a man who had chosen peace and meant to keep it. Finally, the stranger spat on the floor, cursed low, and shoved past the door. His boots crunched off into the snow until only silence remained. May's knees weakened, but Caleb was already at her side, steadying her with a touch as firm as bedrock. She looked up at him, the question heavy on her tongue. Would he come back? Would the past always come knocking? Caleb shook his head gently, as if reading her thoughts. The past has teeth, May, but it don't own us. Not anymore. And so the maze table carried on. The children kept coming. Travelers left with full bellies and lighter hearts. The ranch hands still swore May's pies healed bones faster than any doctor. And in the quiet hours, when the lamps were low and the fire dimmed to embers, May and Caleb would sit together, their hands intertwined, not speaking of fear, nor of what might come tomorrow, because they had already learned the hardest truth. The only thing stronger than sorrow was the choice to keep living anyway. The years stretched forward like a trail across endless plains, and theirs was no longer a story of survival. It was one of building, brick by brick, meal by meal, moment by moment, a life that others could lean on when their own had faltered. And in the end, when folks spoke of the maze table, they didn't just talk of the food or the warm fire on cold nights. They spoke of May's laughter that healed like medicine, of Caleb's silence that steadied storms, and of the way two broken souls had turned a ranch cookhouse into a beacon on the Montana plains.